Welcome everyone to another episode of the Catributors podcast. We have our reoccurring guest here, Drak, tonight in his car. But
hello.
He's still probably more knowledgeable and better prepared than we are. So
I think the only real difference is you can't show off all the books stacked behind you.
Yes, this is true. Unfortunately, I mean, I could reach into the boot and pull out like 3 different swords because Hemoglass beckons once we're done here, but I don't think that's necessarily applicable to Warships. Not until they introduce boarding actions, anyway.
For anyone that doesn't know, Drak's also a bit into his reenactments. It's not that he just randomly drives around with swords. We should point out.
Yes.
You know, just for any law professionals and police officers that might be watching.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, for tonight's topics, we have a short recap of the hybrid battleships that are now basically released, and then we will have mostly the European destroyer line to talk about, and some dev blocks.
Yes, well, the new branch of European destroyers, we should say, just in case anyone's confused.
Yes. The grab bag, as opposed to
the non-Swedish line.
So, I mean, the hybrid battleships, I personally haven't really played them yet. I think Jedi has. And we have basically...
I got as far as getting the Nebraska with the pre-release event. And I didn't want to spend any money on it. So you can get the Nebraska and you can get the camo without spending any money on it. If you want to get further than that, you have to start spending money on boxes to get tokens. If you've got a bunch of community... tokens or whatever they're called, you can swap those for some extra American tokens as well, but I didn't want to do that. So it's I actually did a video on it as well for anyone that wants to go check that out on my channel, but it is it's basically like one of the all forward designs, except you have the addition of a flight deck that is a big old HE trap basically. They're not, I don't think they are particularly armoured compared to some of the actual aircraft carrier flight decks. So, it's not really a good idea to get in a position where you're having lots of HE spam coming in at you. And it's also certainly not a good idea to pretend you don't have guns and that you're only an aircraft carrier, because you make for a particularly poor aircraft carrier, to be honest. Like the bombs themselves, when you get to use them, are pretty good, but you have to be using the guns as well. You just can't, because they're the classic thing as with the other hybrids. If it's on it's a consumable on a cooldown essentially rather than squads. So
yeah, I mean, as we were saying before we started, Kearsarge is kind of the predecessor of these 3, and I've always played Kearsarge as basically an oddly looking Montana that you occasionally duck out of spotting or into cover of the island when you're very confident.
Even though I think because it's a dedicated design that was sort of designed from the ground up, and it is a bit unique in that regard, because all of the others that we have in game are conversions essentially, or proposed conversions. Kearsarge basically gets the full broadside, whereas everybody else so far has a cut down broadside essentially. Kearsarge is like, just in terms of its main battery, it's still it's a pretty powerful tier 9 battleship. It's got this great big weak spot for HE spam, whereas the hybrid line are they're the cut down versions. So yeah, you definitely feel the extra accuracy with the guns. I'm trying to find the Sigma figure now for Nebraska, but 2.0 Sigma for Nebraska. So I can't remember what North Carolina has in comparison, but I don't think it's that good. They're interesting. You can't charge in and tank in the same way, but you can put the guns to good use. Apparently North Carolina is 2.0 as well, but maybe there's some other part of the accuracy curve that's different. I don't know. So,
I mean, with battleship accuracy, it's hard to tell with only a few battles, right? Because luck just plays a huge factor.
That's true. I've not played it that much yet. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the tier 9 and tier 10 are like. And I do think, like, just aside from the issue, you know, even in a game where there's no CVs, you might still have planes buzzing around and spotting you, which is you know, more planes than before, which is going to be annoying for people, especially destroyer players. They're not a terrible addition to the game overall. Sort of, well, you know, they're not quite one or the other, and the real life weaknesses that would have imposed don't matter quite so much in Warships, but that weakness is still there to some extent, so they sort of force you to play differently.
I think they're a very high skill ceiling ship. You know, if you just roll out with one, you don't know what to expect. You're actually probably more of a liability. If you use it cleverly and you get the right kind of map, you can do really, really well with one. But at the same time, it's because you've only got this limited countdown number of aircraft. I think it's a little bit odd in that there is this very, very high skill ceiling to use it well, but its total effectiveness on the battlefield is limited by the fact it's neither one nor the other.
Yeah.
Whereas if you get someone who's really good at playing carriers, you might as well just say, okay, good game. 3 minutes in.
True. Yeah, a lot of it comes down to like finding the right situations to use those planes. And like how the battle develops. Because if you're in a battleship and you could constantly engage with your main guns, you'd be more effective just doing that. But if you're in a battle where maybe you need the spotting of the planes, or your flank is already done and you're just transitioning to the outflank and so on. So there are opportunities to use the planes well, depending on how the battle goes.
I almost wonder if they wouldn't have benefited. I know it might have been a bit too gimmicky, but the what do you call them? Combat orders or whatever that is, the super ships. Some of the
combat instructions.
Combat instructions, that's it. Yeah. So just every so often you get a more accurate shot, or you get ability to launch a bigger squad of planes, or, you know, something. So yeah, as it is, they're kind of interesting, but I think they're a bit niche.
Okay, shall we move to the main topic, the European destroyers?
Yes. So we've got from a new line from tier 5 to tier 10. And unlike the existing line, which is mostly Swedes, some of the lower tiers aren't Swedish, should point out. But it's mostly Swedish branch. This is going to be a mix of, let's see if I can run down what we've got. We've got a Turkish, Norwegian, but British really. We've got Polish, but British. We have a Yugoslav, but French. We have a funky-looking Greek thing, which is based off British design, and then we have a Polish based on a French design. So they really are quite a mixed bag, really. I think most of them did actually exist, though. Just trying to think which ones didn't. I think 9 and 10.
I think, yeah. Well, I mean, the tier 10, its baseline unit, the Mogador, it exists, but the ship itself never. And the variant
this is what if this ship had been used by Poland. And the Tier 9 similarly is what if this design had been gone for by the Greek fleet.
Yeah, I think the difference is that, as I said, the baseline unit for the Tier 10 did actually exist and enter service just as a French vessel, whereas the Tier 9 it's a pre-study, which in and of itself is quite an interesting thing to talk about when we get to it. But a ship with that hull form and armament never actually existed.
Mm.
But all the rest did, which is quite nice.
Indeed. Yeah. We also have another couple of ships on this page as well, some premiums. So we've got Eli, which is going to be pretty similar to the Duca d'Aosta, which is basically post-war reparation. It was, in this case, the Eugenio de Savoia. I do love these Italian names, which was transferred to Greece in 1950. And we have the Nottingham, which is a rather funky-looking treaty cruiser design. With it looks like a mini Nelson, basically.
Yeah.
And then we have the Gato, which we now know at this point is going to be a steel ship as a Tier 10 US submarine. So let's start with then the Moavenet or Moavenet. I'm not sure how one. Moavenet sounds a bit French, really. A Tier 5, which is based on a British I-class destroyer.
Yeah. So this is kind of shades of the run up to World War One, where people have ordered a bunch of ships from British shipyards, and then war comes, and the British are like, we kind of like those.
Yes.
Except this time it's a little bit more cordial between Britain and what's now Turkey, as opposed to what had been the Ottoman Empire. So that it's actually done all by agreement and basically kind of compulsory purchase. You see quite a few of these units in British service in the early part of World War II, where you have countries that have looked at British designed destroyers. In this case, its basis is the I-class, which, with the best of in the world, a lot of the 1930s British destroyers can almost be interchangeable, like the G's and the I's and so forth, because they're all 4 guns in single mounts, 2 forward, 2 aft, in super firing pairs, a couple of sets of torpedo launchers amidships. They're all roughly the same size. They're all roughly the same speed. We've got Gallant in the game, which is obviously a G class.
Icarus at Tier 5's an I class, I believe, or is that Tier 6? Oh no, so Icarus is Tier 6. Yeah.
So there's not a huge variation in real life in a lot of those destroyers, just minor incremental changes. And with these ones, this is basically the Turkish Navy going, we like these, but we'd like the following customizations for our own Navy, which are relatively minor. And then obviously some of them are still being built in British yards at the time World War II breaks out, so they get taken into British service and then returned. Well, the ones that survive get returned at the end of the war.
Yes.
And it kind of works out because they're kind of like 90-95% interchangeable with the bulk of the British destroyer fleet, and usually, because they have the tweaks are usually minor upgrades here and there, they're usually actually quite well received ships because they'll be slightly more capable than average.
There was this long period through, I guess the 20s and 30s, where you just have these sort of almost incremental iterations of destroyer design, and I guess it's not really until like the tribals that you get something that's distinctly different. Or
yeah,
dead wrong?
Well, I mean, it for the British, that's very true.
Okay.
It's kind of similar to what you see with cruiser design when the British are building the Arethuses and the Leanders. They're desperate to get as many holes in the water with as much interchangeability as possible, given the size of their commitments. The French and the Italians to a certain extent, but certainly definitely the French and the Japanese have at various points gone for much bigger, if you like, super destroyers. So the Japanese led the charge with that at the end of the 1920s. The French started to go that way as well. Then you had the First London Naval Treaty, which closed that particular loophole as to what defined a destroyer. It not only set displacement limits for the destroyers, but it also even set, well, as you go through the 1930s and the various treaty restrictions, you get not just this is the maximum displacement for a destroyer, but also, at the top end, only a certain percentage of your destroyer fleet can be of the maximum displacement, and the rest have to be lesser. Which, for the British, you tend to see that in terms of them building a flotilla leader per flotilla, which is usually a slightly larger ship, which will have a fifth gun and some extra space in the superstructure for a flotilla commander. The Americans go a slightly different route. They tend to build the smaller destroyers they're allowed to build in bulk, and then they build a few classes of flotilla leaders. So that's where you see the pre-war American destroyer designs that have 4 twin 5-inch 38 mounts, which I'm still not entirely sure how they manage it, but some bright spark comes up with the idea of, well, the twin 5-inch 38 is a dual purpose weapon because we're putting it on the Atlantas and the North Carolinas. So if we make it single purpose, so surface action only, we can make them lighter, and then we can get these flotilla leader destroyer classes in under the displacement limit. And somehow they managed to make a single purpose gun mount heavier than the dual purpose one. So that was not even
I mean, I'm tempted to ask if Buward was involved somehow.
Most likely, I mean, it is. They are
behind the scenes.
So they are the ones who are in charge of the guns. But the French and the Italians haven't really signed up. They don't sign up to everything in the London Naval Treaty, and that includes the destroyer limit. So the French continue with the super destroyers, the Contre-Torpilliers that we all know and love. The Italians as well, and so you end up with this kind of. Everyone's looking around because the Japanese at first tried to actually stick to the limits with the Hatsuharas. They're kind of like, well, okay, let's try and take all the armament that we had and the speed and everything, but we'll try and fit them into the new displacement limits. That turns out to not work too well. And so they gradually just start ignoring the limits. And so Britain, when it comes to the tribals, they're looking at most of their 1930s production run and going, we've got a lot of destroyers. But now we're looking at, they're a lot smaller and considerably outgunned by practically everything that everyone except the States is currently building. Once the Germans get into the game, they're kind of going the French route of big destroyers as well. Mm-hmm. And that's what leads to this kind of sudden break where you go from relatively small fleet destroyers to the tribals, which are these massive gunboats in comparison. And actually, the British think they're a little bit of a step too far, so they wind it back a little from 8 guns to 6, but go from 1 torpedo launcher back up to 2 again. But the I class are a bit of a weird one in the war because they're relatively modern when World War II starts. I mean, there's still V&Ws kicking around from World War I, so they're considerably more than those. But they do get used for some rather odd purposes. For example, when you have the battle or the action, depending if you call it off Lofoten, between Renown and the 2 Scharnhorsts, there are some I-class in Renown's escort, but along with some H's and G's and so forth, they've been reconfigured as mine layers, so they're actually minimally armed, which is one of the reasons why the destroyers don't tend to engage in that action, apart from the fact that the weather's awful and they can't keep up. There's only a few full fat destroyers there at the time. But at the same time, it does show their adaptability because you are able to remove considerable portions of these destroyers' weapons to turn them into fast mine layers. and then when they get back to harbour, they have them put back on again, so they can fight. So you find the I-class scattered around, and the various, including this particular destroyer, the various bought-in destroyers get usually lumped in with whatever their closest relatives are, albeit not all the time, because occasionally you'll end up with these like scratch flotillas of, well, what's left? Kind of like that scene from Disney's Atlantis: The Lost Empire. It's like, who's not dead? Sound off. And then it just gets thrown together. Congratulations, you're now this new flotilla. Have fun.
So how much are we betting that we will soon see an I-class mine layer in the game?
I mean, I was about to say that, yeah, if they're going into mines, we'll get some of those, I'm sure.
Well, we had mines in the Dunkirk event, didn't we?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. I mean, I was about to say I don't know how they game balance them, but then again, 6 months, 6, 8, 10 months ago, I was saying that about submarines, so I'm going to shut up about that.
Now, probably the biggest difference, I mean, in terms of gun performance, I'm not seeing anything radically different. I think it's a little bit shorter range than Icarus, but then it is a lower tier. But yeah, it does have rather short-ranged, rather weak torpedoes, which is a bit in contrast to... I mean, the EU line generally has weak torpedoes, but they've at least tended to have good range. So it seems like the focus is going to be more on the guns than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, they've dragged, as you said, they've dragged a tier 6 down to this level, so they're going to hit with a nerf bat somewhat. Otherwise, it's going to be a bit hilarious.
Yes. So yeah, compared to the Visby, where are we? Visby's got 8-kilometer torpedoes with the same damage. This has got 6-kilometer torpedoes with just over 6,000. Which I think 6 kilometers. That's basically the stock range of the Icarus. So, useful for finishing off something that's really, really damaged, but you can't even try and do chip damage whilst being stealth with them. So you're going to have to rely on the guns a lot more.
You do have smoke, though, right?
That's true, yes. I don't know if it says how long the smoke is going to last, though. It says smoke generator, so you would hope it would be longer duration smoke, considering you're going to be relying on the guns a lot more, but I guess we'll see.
Well, then at tier 6, we have the destroyer Stort. I'm probably mispronouncing that.
Yeah, so this is another British design, one that was transferred to... it says it's transferred to the Norwegian Navy. I'm guessing this is like to the...
Free Norwegian.
Yes, essentially the people that have managed to get out.
Yeah, so this was actually quite a common practice, because the Norwegians, the Poles, the Dutch to a certain extent, and the French, all the free navies of any particular size usually manage to get out of their native countries with some of their fleet, some of their destroyers at least. But they faced a few problems. I mean, firstly, obviously, those destroyers may or may not be really interoperable, which would make it made keeping them in service a little bit more difficult. Second, a lot of those destroyer fleets weren't particularly large to begin with, and once they put out the call for volunteers, they actually the free navies, in contrast to the main Royal Navy, actually usually had an embarrassment of riches when it came to volunteers for their crews. The Royal Navy, obviously trying to man everything that they could get that could float, was a bit short, and so you ended up with a situation of the British building these wartime emergency flotillas, which for the most part tended to take take off of a theme of their immediate pre-war destroyer designs, which basically were the tribals and the follow-up six gunners, the J's, K's, L's, M's, and N's. So they're actually fairly large hulls, and they for the pre-war period anyway. And they went, okay, well, we know how to build these already. We've got the mechanics of the machinery in place. It's somewhat simpler and easier to build single gun mounts rather than the more complex twin gun mounts. And since we're having to adapt with new anti-aircraft weaponry, radar, new fire control systems, depth charges, sonar, etc., etc., there's also something of a weight saving to be had. So your standard wartime emergency flotilla destroyer is basically your immediate pre-war relatively large hull, 4.7-inch guns, and a pair of torpedo launcher sets, whether they're quadruples or quintuples, and then all this other stuff added to them. You don't really see much of a change in that in almost all of the classes, barring a few minor exceptions here and there, until you get to the end with the sort of the Z class, and then when it loops back round again in the late war, you start to see the introduction of the 4.5-inch gun. But the vast majority of wartime emergency flotillas are essentially slightly larger variants on the pre-war destroyer designs that predate the tribals, like the I's and the G's and the H's. And Stored is one of these. So she actually has quite a decent combat history for World War II. She's handed over to the Free Norwegian Navy and told her you get to man it, and spends a good chunk of her career actually relatively close to what should have been and eventually would become her home waters on Arctic convoy duty. And just so she's around for the sinking of Scharnhorst, amongst other things, operating alongside British destroyer flotillas. And this is what you tend to see, especially with the kind of the gifted ships, because they are literally just, in this case, a wartime emergency flotilla destroyer with a flag changed. And so you end up with like one or two pre-insert name of country here Navy destroyers attached to a British destroyer flotilla. So that's why you see Pierron, the Polish destroyer, ends up getting attached to the tribal flotilla that goes after Bismarck. Stored is attached to the destroyer flotilla that happens to be around for the Battle of North Cape. And there's a few others that are basically in a similar boat.
Yeah, it's almost a bit weird seeing what looks like quite a large hull with only the single mounts, but now you've given that explanation, it does make sense as to the constraints of wartime construction and sort of simplicity of operation. So yeah, I think this is also probably, I don't think we've got any other Norwegian ships in the game, so that ought to make one or two Norwegians happy. And the fact that it's a relatively storied ship as well.
Yeah, the Norwegians, unfortunately, they don't really get too much of a look in because Germany takes them over so quickly and so early.
Yeah.
They don't have the even by the standards of sort of the home defense navies of Europe in 1939, 1940, they don't have the world's biggest or the world's most modern, and a good chunk of it gets sunk by or taken by the Germans. Yeah. So a relatively small amount of the actual Norwegian Navy gets out of there and back over to the UK. But there is a fairly, like with Poland, weirdly enough, there is a fairly large merchant fleet out there, and they draw additional sailors from the merchant fleets, partially because a lot of the merchant sailors at some point have some naval experience, not necessarily all of them, but they're able to bulk their numbers up from there, and hence these new ships. And also especially because the thing is, if you look at the Polish ones like Grom and Błyskawice, they're actually quite capable vessels. They're quite large, whereas, as I said, with the best will in the world, the pre-war Norwegian destroyers are not hugely powerful ships. They're a little bit old.
They were doing everything on quite a tight budget, really.
Yeah. So if you've got this old, slightly broken down destroyer of questionable value for much else other than maybe mid-Atlantic convoy work, and probably not even then. It makes more sense to go here, have a brand new destroyer that's bigger and more capable, and transfer the crew over to that. Which all round is going to be better, because if you have to do convoy escort work, you can, and if a big bad German battleship shows up, you've got a much better chance of fighting it.
Just looking at the prelim stats, slightly faster firing with it's the same 120mm guns, which makes sense. They're British. Same number of them. 4-second reload, which is pretty decent, especially for tier 6. Same torpedoes, it looks like, 6 kilometers, a little bit more damage. So again, really only suitable for dashing in and finishing off heavily damaged targets. But at least you get 2 launchers at tier 6 instead of the 1 launcher at tier 5. Something has to be particularly damaged at tier 5 to finish it off with 4 torpedoes that do a maximum of 6,200.
Yeah.
Surface detectability 7 kilometers. So with captain skills, that'll be 6 point. Is that going to be 6.3, 6.4, something
6.3, something like that.
6.3, yeah, which is not bad for tier 6. And speed also seems decent-ish. And again, the same consumables: damage control, smoke gen, and engine boost. So we'll see what that's like. Tier 6 is not a bad spot for a lot of destroyers. It's when you get to tier 7 that things get a bit sticky. Because then you've got decent ships at tier 6 to contend with, and then much stealthier ships at tier 8 to contend with. So yeah. So talking of tier 7, that brings us a nice segue onto the Grom, which is a sister ship of the aforementioned Błyskawica.
Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, both destroyers get away from Poland and get over to the UK and form the core of the Free Polish Navy, along with Burza, which is a slightly older predecessor to them. Grom, unfortunately, unlike her sister, doesn't have a tremendously long life. She gets hit and sunk pretty early on in the war, which I think is probably why they've brought her in for here, because although we've got Błyskawica in the game, she reflects the kind of the later wars, later in her career modifications. So Grom is close enough that they could probably reuse the basic hull and superstructure in the model, but different enough that with those early capabilities, she's different enough to merit having her own entry.
Yeah, and I think also it probably made the balance a little bit easier when they already had Błyskawica at tier 7 to put Grom in at tier 7 also. When they kind of have that baseline to work off. And it's also maybe they just didn't have anything from another navy that was really suitable for that tier 7 slot. So
yeah, and it's nice to see an original flavor Polish destroyer in place, because they could have done the Burza, but as I said, she was the predecessor to the Grom class, so
maybe a stretch for tier 7.
Yeah, you would have been pressing your luck a little bit to get her in at 7. She would have been a powerful 6, but a pretty awful 7, to be honest. And interestingly enough, in terms of names, the Polish Navy has actually some pretty cool names for its ships. It's just disguised by the fact that, being Polish to our English ears, they don't seem to mean anything, as compared to sometimes you can just about work out roughly what a French, Spanish, Italian, or German name is on about. But the Błyskawica and Grom are actually lightning and thunder, or thunderbolt, depending on exactly how you translate it.
Yes, they do. They do actually have quite a good line of names, even if they have never had historically a particularly large navy. Yeah, they're quite well named. It is, like you say, it's not the sort of later war Błyskawica that we have. they have slightly messed up with the stats because it says main battery 1x1, 120mm. Much like Bushkevitsa, it doesn't only have the one gun. One of its mounts is a single mount, and the other 3 are twin mounts. So you've gone up to 5 guns.
No. If you go down in the article, it says 1x1, and then the stats, and then it says 3x2.
Oh, you're right.
Then
It does.
same
It just
stats.
does it in a confusing way.
Okay.
They are the same. They gave them. I missed that. That's a bit weird, but never mind. It's the same stats for each. So yeah, same reload as Bushkevitsa, 6 seconds. Slightly worse gun range. Again, quite short range torpedoes. In fact, it's the same 6-kilometer torpedoes as the previous 2 tiers, but now you have again slightly more damage. It's twin triple tubes this time as opposed to twin quad tubes. So yeah, it's not. In fact, it's the same damage, isn't it? So it's actually less damage output with these torpedoes. And they reload the same as well. So in terms of torpedoes, this is actually a downgrade from tier 6, apparently. I'm hoping that gets a bit rebalanced later on, but I guess we'll see. It does have the same fast 39-knot surface speed of the Bushkevitsa, though, which is nice. That's one of the nice things about that ship. It's one of the OG fast destroyers before we got things like the super fast French destroyers and Italians and things in the game as well. So,
but we also have Leningrad at this tier, and isn't
that's
it
true,
just like outperforming
also.
Bushkevitsa in like everything?
Yes, pretty much. Bushkevitsa's been a bit power crept, unfortunately. Heck, I did a video with the Sims the other day, and that's definitely been power crept. It's definitely a question as to how good a smoke these are going to have. I hope it's going to be a good smoke. I think it'll have to be a good smoke to make up for some of the other the deficiencies that we're seeing in these initial stats.
What's shaping up to be mainly a gun-focused destroyer line. I think 7 guns on one will probably be quite nice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I said 5 before, didn't I? It's not 5, it's 7. 6 barrels in twin mounts and then the single barrel at the start. Yeah. So yeah, it is a good number of guns for tier 7, just like Bushkevitsa.
Well, that, I guess, brings us to split the tier 8.
Yeah. Poor. I was looking the history of this destroyer up, and you've got to have sympathy for the Yugoslavian Navy is not quite as cursed as the Greek Navy when it comes to trying to build ships only to have war interfere and people run off with them or not build them. But they come pretty close, and with split, the Italians if you want to define it loosely as the Mediterranean, if you include the Black Sea, which is technically its own separate thing, but kind of in the rough operational area, the Italians were kind of a great exporter of destroyers and destroyer designs. And in this case, you kind of like with the Polish Navy as well, which was obviously just the previous tier down, a lot of the smaller navies where they had any budget at all in the late 1930s were going down the relatively sensible line of we can't possibly match the larger navies for numbers, so we're not even going to try, but what we are going to do is have a small number of very high quality destroyers on the basis that if we do end up having to defend ourselves in some way, shape or form, if we go up against equal numbers, some of our ships might come home because they're individually better. But poor old Split ends up in Italian hands before ever seeing Yugoslavian service, gets renamed to basically the same name but in Italian, then manages to survive the war, and then end up back under the flag she was originally supposed to be under, which was, I suppose, relatively good fortune for her. But yeah, she's just kind of like with Tashkent is another example of the same thing. Except obviously Tashkent's Russian, with turning to Italian design skill for a nice big fast destroyer, and obviously a relatively successful design, since she survived obviously Allied attempts to get rid of her and then later German attempts to get rid of her. So yeah, I'm quite pleased to see her in the game, because she's a destroyer that very, very few people I think will have heard about before her introduction.
I think the Yugoslav Navy, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, I should say. I mean, in some ways, it's like the successor to the Austro-Hungarian Navy after the breakup of that after World War One, but they were sort of starting from scratch, really. So yeah, they didn't have really time to establish themselves for the Italian invasion in 1941, something like that. And then sort of not that long after post-war, you end up with Tito becoming head of the sort of provisional state at the end of the war, and then after that it became sort of communist Yugoslavia. So it's definitely sort of a bit niche, but it is interesting to see it in the game. And it's actually got quite unique gun caliber as well. The only other navy I can think of that had, it notes here that the Czechoslovak 140mm guns, and to my knowledge, I think the only other navy that used those was, in sort of modern times anyway, was Japan. But there might be other obscure ones I haven't had knowledge of that used that as a caliber. So
just almost,
it's almost, but not quite, the French 139 mils, slightly bigger.
Yeah, that's it's a 5-point-something inch gun, which is, again, I mean, I do find it interesting actually, though, because you have this destroyer and a bunch of others similar to her that are able to mount these fairly heavy guns, and yet on the other side of the continent, if you head north, you have the Germans trying to mount, again, similar sort of 5 to 5.9 inch guns on their destroyers, and actually having a pretty terrible time of it when it comes to seakeeping and stability. Which I guess in part reflects the fact that the Italians have been able to keep designing destroyers since the First World War, rather than having that enforced break caused by Versailles. But I'm wondering now, given the small but vocal population of people on the internet in warship-related comment sections, now that Split is being introduced, I'm waiting to see the inevitable campaign to get Dubrovnik in as well, because she was a destroyer the Yugoslavian Navy actually had and managed to briefly fight with before she and ended up going off to do other things. But yeah, that'll be interesting. Maybe that'll be a premium or of some description. But it's I think this is now, I think, the last one we have, which is fully existential.
Yes. I think the version, I mean, it notes the version that we have with the Czechoslovakian guns is not kind of how it ended up.
No.
Due to also, World War II. But it did eventually end up back with communist Yugoslavia. So it existed, it was in service. And we kind of, what we have is sort of how it was intended to be finished rather than how it actually ended up being. It does. I mean, I've just been looking at the stats, and the 120s all pretty much behave how you would expect, but you get a decent bump to shell damage with the 140s, but they are just looking at them, functionally identical to the French 139s in terms of damage, initial shell velocity, HE penetration, stuff like that. So it seems like, I mean, obviously the ballistics we don't know, but they may well end up patterning it after French ballistics as well. So it might end up feeling quite French. I guess we'll see with those guns. But yeah, they are pretty substantial guns for a destroyer, certainly. Still only 6-kilometer torpedoes, though. The damage is up to now 10,700, and they're still fast. But again, this is only a pair of triple mounts, so it does limit the amount of damage you can put out. Because of course, by the time you get to this tier, battleship and cruiser hit points have been steadily expanding. So,
but it is the tier where the radar starts.
Yes. So it's going to be that much harder to do ambush drops on people.
No. I mean, it has radar itself. It's the tier where it can radar.
Yes, yeah. This is the big break in the line. Tier 8, 9, and 10 all get the ability to mount a short duration, fairly long range radar, which is going to be the sort of the gimmick of the high tiers. So this we do have some numbers for. Duration of 10 seconds, range 9 kilometers, 60-second reload, which is actually pretty quick, and 4 charges. So obviously you're able to bump that up to 5. That's also the same for the tier 9, and I think the tier 10 as well, interestingly.
So basically, it let you know what's around, so you can decide whether or not you want to charge in. Which, to be fair, this ship, along with Grom, should be able to kind of hightail it in on an attack run if it wants to. Yeah,
it's not quite as fast, but 38 knots is still a decent speed. It's got an okay number of hit points. Surface detectability 9.5, but of course, tier 8 you can mount the concealment module as well as use the captain's skill at that point. So that will take you down to 6 point something still, I think. They're not especially stealthy. Yeah, it's interesting. It's actually fewer guns than the previous tier, but obviously more punchy guns.
I mean, 9.5 should come down to like 7.6, which is pretty bad stealth. But with a 9-kilometer radar,
I thought it was lower than that. I can't do the numbers in my head very well.
You can go into like the camp, and once you detect it, you just radar them. You might only have 10 seconds, but you get 10 seconds.
It's a
You'll get like 3 salvos or so in.
Yeah, so it's enough time to get a couple of your own volleys off. But it's not really... It's more the radar you use for fixing someone's position or maybe scaring them out of smoke, as opposed to like an American radar where you actually have a chance to do some serious damage or even finish someone off.
The thing is, first of all, you aren't necessarily sure who is shooting you, and the others is other ships will get like 1 salvo off. Like there's a 6-second delay, right? So other ships have 4 seconds. But in 4 seconds, if you are prepared, you can get a salvo off.
If you time it right, if people have their guns pointed in the right direction to begin with.
And there is only like a 60-second reload, so you don't
that's probably
have,
the biggest advantage of this. The longish range. I mean the Pan-Asian radar that you can take in place of smoke, I think that's only 7.5 kilometers at best.
I think that's the usual destroyer radar, is about 7.5.
And if someone spotted you and you use the radar to light off and spot them, then as you're leaving the area, the torpedo range might not actually be too bad, because if you drop a set of torpedoes behind you as you leave, if they're closing you down, they're probably going to run into the range of those torps.
Yeah, it would actually be interesting thinking about that as a thing. If you had the option of what speed you wanted the torpedoes to be going at, because when you're making that kind of drop, slower torpedoes can actually be an advantage. Fast torpedoes will run through their track quite quickly, so an enemy ship might not have time to sail into the range of them, but slower torpedoes quite often Like you get this with some of the mid-tier US destroyers where the torpedoes are relatively short-ranged, but they're not particularly fast, and actually you can end up with people sailing into them, whereas faster torpedoes actually would have just run out before the enemy ship had a chance to get into range. So
But
but
it's more of a
they're
niche
fast
case.
torpedoes. So sorry, say that again.
I think that's more of a niche case. You'd much rather have this, the fast ones. I mean, torpedoes are great self-defense when you're in a smoke, right? If you're destroyed, it mostly relies on its guns. Because if you're like something like a Groningen, right, and people know you don't have torpedoes, they can just, like a bigger battleship, just sails into your smoke because you can't do anything. So just having those self-defense torpedoes is pretty great, even if you're gun focused.
It's probably, I mean, having said what I said, it's probably more useful to have fast torpedoes overall. It's generally harder for people to dodge torpedoes coming at 70 odd knots, especially when you can bump that up even further with captain skills and ship equipment. But yeah, 6 kilometers though does make them rather tricky to use in a lot of situations.
Well, of course, this is all prior to balance changes, etc. So
yes, this is all. It's possible this will all change. I mean, these are the preliminary numbers. We have had cases before where they've changed some major aspect of a ship line, such as short-range torpedoes, for example. But yeah, the radar will potentially be very interesting, though, in terms of making this an attractive division boat.
Yes.
The fact that it gets smoke and radar, and even if it's only a short duration radar, the fact that it does reload quite quickly, I can see this being quite useful in divisions, and maybe even in terms of more kind of esports style things like Kings of the Sea, where the ability to have short burst but fast cooldown radar could potentially be very useful. Anyway, so onto the Tier 9.
It's a very interesting gun layout there at the front.
Yes.
Yeah, it's one of those slightly weird things in interwar naval design that you have the larger French contre-torpilleurs, the super destroyers. You have the Italian esploratori and condottieris as well. And they're kind of all filling this intermediate gap between. They're a little bit too big to really be destroyers compared to everybody else's, but they're a little bit too small, at least for the early condottieris, to be fully cruisers. So there's kind of either very small cruiser or very large destroyer. And people tend to associate that concept with the French and the Italians, basically because they built them. But then maybe people don't always realize that the British kept looking at this idea and multiple times, and each time ended up not going for it for various reasons. I mean, the tribals have their origins in a similar kind of not quite destroyer, not quite cruiser design V, which they eventually led to the tribals and the Didos, which are kind of the split the difference. But this is a sort of a throwback to a slightly earlier variant, looking at the design the E-class cruisers.
Now, when the E-class, they mean Emerald and Enterprise, I wonder.
Yes.
Okay.
The explosive pinatas down at the lower tiers.
Yes.
British cruiser line. But this is kind of, again, looking at this slightly smaller option, where it's a very, I think, in all honesty, this is really a very small late World War I, early interwar cruiser that's masquerading as a destroyer because it's competing in a level that's mostly going to be mid to late World War II destroyers. So it's they've kind of caught up displacement and firepower wise.
I was wondering, again, 140mm guns like its predecessor. I'm wondering if these are meant to be British Or are these Greek guns, or are these again Czechoslovakian weapons?
So
It doesn't really say.
I think 140 is 5.5 inch, if I'm not mistaken. In which case, that would actually be a rather fun throwback if someone wants to do the quick math to confirm whether I'm correct.
It's 5.5. Yeah.
Yeah, so that would actually be a rather interesting reference to the fact that in the First World War, there were some cruisers being built for the Greek Navy, and they ended up being, as with a bunch of other stuff, taken into Royal Navy service. One of them being HMS Chester, famously of the Battle of Jutland fame, where the boy seaman on the front gun won the VC for basically sticking to his gun when everyone else had been killed. But one of the changes that was made compared to what at the time was the World War One British Town class, no relation to the interwar Town class.
Royal Navy did like to reuse their class names.
Yes, and so the Royal Navy Town class were gradually trending towards being armed first with a mixture of 6 and 4 inch, and then later actually just basically 6-inch guns. The Greek variants had a 5.5 inch, and that 5.5 inch actually proved successful enough in Royal Navy service that HMS Furious was armed with it as a secondary battery in its initial form, whereas Courageous and Glorious had 444s, as did Renown and Repulse. And Furious's original design was also with 444s, but they changed it to 5.5s. And also HMS Hood carries the 5.5 in its original form. And that all stems from the British taking these supposed to be Greek cruisers into their in service and going, actually, this 5.5 inch gun is pretty handy because it shoots basically near enough as makes no difference, about as far as a 6 inch. It hits almost as hard as a 6 inch, but it turns out because the shell and cartridge is a bit lighter than a 6 inch, it's actually much easier to handle the ammunition and keep up a high rate of fire in the high seas in a small cruiser. So I guess with this design, they've basically gone, I guess Wargame have basically gone, well, here's a small kind of not quite cruiser, not quite destroyer, small variant on the E-class. But if the Greeks had bought the design, they would have wanted their 5.5 inch on it instead. And hence we now have this thing.
Okay. Yeah, I was just looking up HMS Chester, actually, which was ordered, in Greek service, it was the Lambros Katsonis. It was ordered as that. So this is where they also got the name from. So that's a interesting little reference back to an actual, one that was supposed to go to the Greek Navy, but again, wartime happened and was bought, compulsorily purchased by the Royal Navy and was scrapped post-war, so it never made it to the Greeks, it seems like.
Yeah. It got a little bit beat up at Jutland, and it was Chester and Birkenhead were the two cruisers. But by the end of the war, the other thing was by the end of the war, you're looking at the British have basically built out the entirety of the C class. They're in the process of building the Ds, the Es, and the Hawkins. And so whilst the Town class or a derivative thereof was a pretty nice ship to have in 1910, 1911, 1912, by the end of World War One, it was clear that they were kind of yesterday's news in terms of cruiser design. And so if you're the Greek Navy, which in and of itself is facing a bit of a budget pressure in the late 1910s, early 1920s, do you really want kind of a battered, patched up second line cruiser and have to pay for the privilege? Because obviously it was unlike the Agincourt, it was compulsory purchased. So if you wanted it back, you actually did have to buy it back, albeit at a reduced price.
It does have clearly a different origin of the guns, but again, it seems like a copy paste of the French 139, so exactly the same as the previous tier. Big jump in hit points though. It's got just over 20,000 hit points, which is pretty decent. 4.4 second reload. Torpedoes, you finally get an increase in range to 7.5 kilometers. Same damage though, 10,700.
4 knots faster.
Yeah, 80 knots. So even harder to dodge if somebody does get into torpedoing range. And again, 38 knots speed. So yeah, I think the surface detectability is the same as the Tier 8 as well. So it's going to be not particularly stealthy, potentially.
And it has like this weird gun layout where like the two front guns
like, listening to this. Yeah. It's got 3 guns forward, but two of them that are on the superstructure, the upper part, are side by side.
Yeah, that's
like
actually a typical throwback to actually pre-World War One design. A lot of smaller cruisers pre-World War One actually had that. Well, they don't necessarily have that exact layout, but they did have a layout where they would have 2 single guns in side-by-side mountings. Especially the small ones, because the bigger armored cruisers obviously would tend to have either a single turret or a twin turret. And as you got into the later towns and then the seas, they would have single 6s.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the earlier cruisers, especially the World War One era Arethuses, which were scout cruisers - large destroyer flotilla leaders, they were more
another reused class name.
Yes. Yeah, they were more interested in all-round fire with lots of smaller caliber weaponry. And so this side-by-side, it basically meant less complication because you didn't have to go through the issues of building a twin mount with all the ammunition hoist and miniature barbette issues that you might have with that. But so it was simplicity, and also to a certain degree, given that they were thinking about having to fight battles where you'd have shells coming in left, right, and center in large numbers but small calibers, it meant if you took a hit to one of your front guns, you still had another front gun, at least in some limited arcs, to use. Whereas a twin mount with a half shield, if it got hit, you'd lose your entire forward battery. Mm-hmm. Whilst there are some, as I said, some justifications for it, realistically, the twin mounting or twin turret later on is actually a better and more efficient solution, which would later be adopted. But for the period that this design has kind of been cobbled together from, it does make a certain amount of sense because it's kind of just a scaled up version of that. Although I must admit, whilst I really like the concept being there, I do also find it slightly weird that we've kind of got late 1930s and early 1940s designs at these higher tiers, and then suddenly we have what's like a 2-decade-old throwback.
It does look rather out of place. I mean, the bridge section sort of definitely harkens to a more modern British destroyer design. But yeah, the rest of it, especially the gun shields where you can clearly see the pedestal mounts. Yeah, we can't even see what the turret arrangement at the back is like because it's 6 turrets overall. So I wonder if that's replicated at the back, perhaps.
When I was looking at the picture earlier, I think I could see at least 2 singles running one after the other along the spine.
Yeah, so it might be that pointing forwards you can use all 3 guns, but pointing back can't directly directly use all 3 guns. It might be you have to be slightly offset to use all 3 of them if they're all in line with the central line.
There'll be one gun right aft, one step down, and then these 2 small guns, which that would be roughly in keeping again with British cruiser design policy of the 1910s and early 20s.
So yeah, this one is, compared to the rest, definitely, like you said, feeling a bit out of place. The others are all unquestionably destroy designs, and then you've got this thing which is based on an E-class cruiser.
Here, have a cool cruiser.
But then we get on to Tier 10, the Gdansk, which is unquestionably a destroyer in its design, although a large destroyer because, as we mentioned, it's based on the French Mogador class, which did exist, but this ship itself, that there wasn't a Mogador in Polish service called the Gdansk.
Well, and interestingly enough, actually, in the middle of World War II, the US decided to arbitrarily redesignate the bigger French destroyers as light cruisers, which can lead to some very confusing reading when you're looking at something like Operation Torch, because depending on who the author is, you'll either have some of the French ships present being described as destroyers, because that's what the French called them, and that's to a certain extent what the British were still calling them, or if it's an American author or someone who's based a lot of their research off of the American battle reports, which, to be fair, they were the main Allied naval presence there, you suddenly find them being referred to as cruisers, especially in like USS Massachusetts battle reports, which can get very confusing sometimes. But no, with this, I mean, it reflects a certain degree of logic. France, along with Italy, was exporting a lot of ships, a lot of small ship designs during the interwar period. The Polish had worked with them before, early on in their naval build-up, and as the summary that Wargaming put together said, Poland, like with Yugoslavia, had decided on the quality over quantity argument, hence Grom and Liskovice earlier. But initially they were very desperate to be able to try and build as much, if not all, of their navy in Polish shipyards. But when they were building the Groms, they came up against the hard reality that as fast and as quickly as they were expanding their shipyard capability, they couldn't afford to expand to the scale of building very large destroyers or cruisers quite as fast as they'd hoped. And so them then turning around to a French shipyard they'd worked with before and gone, hey, well, we want the next generation in even larger destroyer. It makes a certain amount of logical sense. But of course, as you said, no Mogador or derivative ever actually served under the Polish flag.
But it's not completely wacky.
No, it makes sense in a kind of a what-if world.
Yeah, certainly more so than what they did with the South American cruisers anyway.
You haven't finished with the what-if world, because Wargaming was like, what if the Polish would have ordered those from the French, and then the Russians would have taken them from the Poland and equipped them with Soviet anti-air defense and radars and torpedoes?
Yeah, Soviet Russia being generous and upgrading its Warsaw Pact cannon fodder, I mean allies, to have a decent amount of forces.
Although, I mean, I say that as a what if, but I mean, it doesn't particularly change anything. I mean, the torpedoes are still fairly weak.
It probably means the AA amounts.
You've actually gone back to. No, I haven't gone back to anything there. Again, 7.5. 11,200. You get quintuple tubes this time. But yeah, they're still pretty weak for the tier. The guns are 139 mil, but functionally the same as the previous two tiers in terms of their stats. 3.7 second reload is good for that caliber, though. I mean, I'm just going to bring up. I can't even remember what the Mogador or the Kleber will be, but there's no way it's sub 4 seconds. No, they've got like a 7-second reload. Kleber's got 7 seconds. So yeah, these are going to be fairly hard-hitting destroyer guns for a pretty respectable reload.
Yeah, they're basically being given Magic Soviet auto-loaded upgrade.
Yes.
I suppose you had to do something to them, because the flip side is the French destroyers have, torpedoes that can actually reach out more than visual range.
The French torps, I mean, they're not brilliant in terms of their range, but they're good enough that you can, in theory, for a lot of the line, you can stealth build. The torps actually do good damage, and they are generally quite fast reloading. So yeah, you can turn your French destroyers into somewhat inefficient torpedo boats, that you'll get out spotted by a lot of stuff, but you can still do a lot of stealth dropping if you're not opposed. But you're just not going to be able to do that with this. But yeah, the one way in which the French destroyers are are definitely superior, though, is the base ranges. So even if you try and build for the absolute best range you can, you're not going to be able to quite match the Mogador or the Kleber. Probably much to the relief of battleship players everywhere who've ever had to face someone whizzing along at like nearly 50 knots when they're speed boosting in their French destroyer, spewing out 139mm HE, and you just can't quite just stand still, you wee bugger, and they just won't.
When you have to zoom out just to be able to get them on the same screen when you try to lead them.
To give them enough lead. So, yeah. But it is going to be, I don't think it's quite as fast as the Kleber, but it gets to max speed 41.2 knots. So, you do get the engine boost with that. You do have potentially captain skills you can enhance that with. So, it's still going to be pretty fast. It's just not going to have quite the speed or quite the range that the Kleber can manage. So these upper-tier ones.
So it's just farming from smoke instead.
Smoke. So this is where if it does get long-lasting smoke, I mean, if these things get like US smoke, this thing sitting in smoke spamming you, it's potentially going to be as annoying as like a Harakaze or a Kitakaze sitting in smoke spamming you, or a Chronigan or something. So could be nasty in that way instead, I guess. We'll see. So yeah, the higher tiers of these definitely seem like they get a bit more interesting than the mid tiers, to be honest. But
it seems to me pre-balance changes that they're going for kind of a relatively fast gunboat line.
Yeah.
With a small sting in the tail if you happen to need it, kind of break glass in case of emergency torpedoes.
Yeah, I think with the Raider, they are supposed to be sort of destroyer hunters.
Yeah, I can see them, like I said before, I can see them working very well, potentially, if played decently in concert with another destroyer player in a division, or maybe some cruiser players. Someone that can back you up when you're making that spot. So, certainly different from the existing EU line, which are very much more torpedo-focused. And the fact that they have both smoke and radar, I mean, of all the things that might change about them, maybe alongside the short torpedo ranges as well, potentially that as a concept might not survive up until the point where they go live, or else they keep both those, but maybe like gun reloads get nerfed or something. So it's definitely worth bearing in mind that these are all very preliminary ship stats. So potentially, I mean, they would certainly be a lot different than the existing EU line, but in terms of how they fit in with other destroyer lines, they're kind of they're not quite. They don't feel like a full-fledged gunboat line compared to some of the other gunboat lines that we've got. Even some of the ones with fast-firing guns and smoke. But there is the big question as well of ballistics. We don't know how these are going to behave. If they're going to have floaty shells as a balance,
and how they are going to be balanced during the balancing.
So potentially, this could be an interesting line. I'm always more interested to see lines of destroyers come in than, say, lines of light cruisers, and we seem to have had a fair few lines of light cruisers of late, and of course, as mentioned, the South American ones yet to come. So we'll see. But at least we're getting a couple of ships in from nations that haven't been represented before, and ships that actually existed and served, which is always nice.
Yes. Yeah, it's nice to see a new line being introduced that's actually, a good majority of it is actually real life ships.
Yes.
With only an occasional paper ship thrown in. I
mean, and of the paper ships, I think the only real kind of wacky one is the Tier 9, to be honest.
Yes.
The Tier 10 does seem at least reasonably plausible.
Yeah.
Whereas the Tier 9 is kind of I don't know, Atlantico levels of what if.
Yeah.
So then we have a couple of premiums on this page as well. So I don't know if we need to go super in depth on the Eli. It's going to be basically Italian cruiser. We could maybe do a sort of detailed-ish comparison with the Duca d'Aosta stats, but I mean that's an okay Tier 6 cruiser, but it's far from amazing. So yeah, it just depends how closely they stick to the same formula. The one thing that did jump out at me is that it's going to have a 16.5 kilometer range, which is pretty good for a Tier 6 cruiser, and certainly beats the Duca with its comparatively much shorter 14.1 kilometer range. But it's got a similarly terrible fire chance considering the caliber of the gun. It's only 7%. So yeah, it looks like the shell characteristics are basically going to be the Italian shell characteristics, which makes sense. It's also got a slightly faster reload. I'm sure it's deficient in some other way.
Yeah, and I mean, it might still change anyway, so.
Yeah, it does get one less consumable. It doesn't get the catapult plane. AA
it's basically
is
just an Italian cruiser under a different flag.
Yeah, this one, if we could say copy-paste premium, as we've said in the past about various things, I think this probably falls under that category of like even in terms of its visual differences are probably going to be fairly minimal.
A few minor changes to justify the fact that it's technically in a post-war configuration.
Yeah, I imagine the AA mounts are going to look a bit different.
Yeah, and we will explain why the plane's gone away as well.
Yeah. Although just looking at the AA numbers, I don't think it's actually even though it's supposed to be post-war, I think the AA might actually be a bit worse in terms of its DPS values.
I'm sure it attracts aircraft just as well as any other ship.
Yeah. No, it's roughly the same and maybe a little bit better in the inner DPS, but not really enough to go, oh wow, that's an amazing... it'll be a Tier 6 AA monster. No, it's not going to be that at all. So, yeah, a little bit faster. It's also a little bit faster. To be honest, it mostly looks like it's going to be a better Duca, but without the spotter plane. But then you've got the baked-in extra range anyway, so who knows? But the more interesting one, though, is going to be the Tier 8 Nottingham.
Yes.
Which, you look at it at a glance, you might compare it to the Hampshire, but the Hampshire is basically a stretched count class, whereas this thing is a 20s treaty design proposal that came out of it mentions Sir George Thurston and Vickers. So I guess it's sort of a what if rather than something the Royal Navy actually was like, oh, let's maybe look at this. It's rather it's like here's a thing that could be built under the Washington Naval Treaty.
Well, surprisingly enough, actually, they did look into this as one of the options for the counties. The idea of the all-forward armament actually recurs several times because the thing is, you've got to remember the county class is technically built in a bunch of distinct subclasses. And when they're initially starting off with what people sometimes call the Kents, and then as they move on, you see these ideas recurring because one of the things they realize very quickly is that they've boxed themselves into a corner with this 10,000-ton, 8-inch gun limit for cruisers, because in the Washington Treaty, that is the limit. The split between the 6-inch and the 8-inch light and heavies is a London Naval Treaty thing. And they suddenly realize that to get a large, fast, 8-inch armed cruiser with any even a 1920s standard anti-aircraft battery plus aircraft launching, etc., it's a bit of a tall order. You've got to sacrifice something somewhere, and for a while, the Royal Navy is looking at various options, going, well, is there any way we can finagle things to have a decent balance of speed, protection, and firepower? And the all-forward layout actually comes up, as I said, several times. There's designs for an all-forward with 6 twins. There's a designs for all-forward with 8 twins. So actually, vaguely similar to Hampshire, although not exactly, because obviously, as you said, Hampshire's kind of more of a 1930s design. But one of the other options is near enough what we see, not exactly, because obviously they've done some modernization effects to her, but is in basic layout is actually what we see here with Nottingham, which is 3 triples all forward in a Nelson style configuration, because then that allows you to shorten up the citadel. And they look at it and they go, we could actually get decent-ish armor, decent speed, and decent firepower on this, but it's a little bit too radical a departure for cruiser design as it is compared for battleship design. And they end up going with the somewhat more conventional county class and going with the box armor configuration instead. Which
I imagine in terms of the treaty limits, there was less of a pressing need for this style of radical design than there was for trying to squeeze everything they wanted into a battleship hull.
Yeah, because with a battleship being in the 1920s the arbiter of naval power, you absolutely needed to have, as far as the Royal Navy was concerned, you needed to have 16-inch guns, because the Japanese have the Nagatos, the Americans have the Colorado, so we need to have a 16-inch gun, and we need to have protection against the same. And almost everything else could go by the wayside in favor of that. With cruisers, they knew they were going to build a fair number of them. There are other design considerations when it comes to cruisers that maybe don't quite apply as much, or they apply differently compared to battleships. Because with the Nelsons, they could make a reasonable supposition that we're probably going to be fighting either vaguely head-on or broadside. It's very unlikely that the British battle line will be running away, so the lack of aft firepower doesn't make much odds. But when you're looking at a cruiser, whether that be a heavy or a light cruiser, not only is there in cruiser actions a much greater chance that you might have to withdraw permanently or even temporarily in an action, but also cruiser and destroyer actions tend to be a lot more free-spirited, a lot more mixed up as compared to a battle line. And it was therefore entirely conceivable that you might end up with somebody sitting behind you in desperate need of a good shooting, and an all-forward design would somewhat hamper you with that. Plus, I come back to my previously stated suspicion that I'm 95% plus sure that whoever was designing the counties actually designed them to have a full armor belt, and just kind of an early example of fitted for but not with.
Yes,
because that's really the main advantage that this design offers, is that you can have a decent-ish amount of armor protection from the start. But if you're planning on kind of cheating slightly by building in the capability for a full armor, then you might as well get the all-round firepower that the fore and aft turret layout gives you. Plus, there was also a slightly misguided idea at the time of the county's conception that maybe you could use the 8-inch as anti-aircraft weapons, for which, again, all-round firepower, coverage, and the simplicity and slightly faster loading of a twin turret would be an advantage, even if it turned out to be basically a pointless boondoggle.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, though, with the armor on the counties. That, like, for anyone thinking, the Italians and the Germans and the Japanese, they were all dirty cheaters when it came to the naval treaties. No, the Royal Navy was doing its fair share of shenanigans with different designs as well, and like getting its own clauses in terms of ship displacement and loading types and things like that, and armor belts, and like everyone was at it, basically finding their own little ways to fiddle things, or just outright ignoring limits.
The basic difference being the Germans, Italians, and Japanese eventually ended up in a situation of, we're just going to build bigger ships and lie about it.
Yeah.
The British were, if nothing, maybe even more sneaky, in that they tended to build ships that were like, this is exactly what the treaty says we can build. And look, you can even weigh it, which you can't do with an Italian ship without giving the game away. It's like, no, you can weigh it. It's going to be 10,000 tons or less. The fact we may have, pre-fitted the capability of completely changing its protection systems in this case, and therefore making a far more effective ship in the event of war is neither here nor there.
It almost just strikes me as the equivalent of the was it the Megamis? Yeah, it was the Megamis where they stuck on the lighter, the 155s, and with the capability of swapping them out later for 8-inch guns. It's a light cruiser.
Yeah.
Wink.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'd still love to find some archival documentation that 100% nails down that was their deliberate intention, but I haven't managed to find that yet. But given that the counties in almost all pre-war photos seem to be riding high or somewhat high, regardless of what their actual loading is at the time, and when they then go in for these refits that put in full-length armor belts, they magically don't ride low, and they don't seem to have any serious weight or stability issues as a result of slapping on, several hundred tons of steel. Makes me kind of lean back and go, that's not what happens when you take a balanced ship design and suddenly add a ton of weight to it.
Yeah.
Somebody has to have planned for this. Either that or the designer was just stupidly lucky. But I don't that lucky when it comes to naval architecture. But I'm interested to see it in the game. I mean, I have a soft spot. I really, really like all forward designs. So I'm going to be really
certainly very unique looking. We don't know what the armor protection of this is going to be like at tier 8. I mean, when it comes to cruisers in game, it might have a decent enough belt. I guess we'll see. But the extremities are always going to be squashy enough for most things to not worry about them. But the range is pretty short though, 15.7.
Also have a smoke though.
Yeah, it does have a smoke, short duration smoke. So it's going to be similar to the Belfast 43 or the British destroyers. 40 seconds of duration.
And it has a healer.
So it'll be interesting to see what it's like. Ones with heals always do better, but I mean, it all sort of depends how many heals it gets, whether it's a regular heal or a super heal. I guess potentially it could be fun.
Yeah, I think the fire arcs are going to be the main thing that's going to be the make or break, because obviously you can't fire all the guns straight forward, but if you can fire them at a fairly shallow angle, that would make it quite fun. If it has to go significantly broadside, when we know that there are ships in the game that actually that their rear fire arcs can almost not quite, but almost rack round forward anyway.
Yeah,
I think that'll be where we make or break the stand on it.
It does seem like it might be decent in terms of its. I mean, its HE performance looks all right. 17% fire chance. 13-second reload is pretty decent.
I mean, it looks like a British attack. It has also anti-kilometer torps, quite a lot of torps.
Yeah, that's true. It does. You've got 4, so you've got 2 quad launchers per side. 10 kilometers, speed's okay. Damage is a bit average for the tier, but it's still pretty decent. But yeah, potentially this could be like when you see the short duration smoke, chances are it's going to be most useful for making a getaway rather than actually sitting and firing from, because you're only going to get a couple of salvos off in that time.
It might help with turning around and running.
Yeah, that's true. It does have a fairly small turning radius of 600 meters. No, wait, that's not that. That's the smoke radius.
700 meters.
700 meters, there we go. But that's still okay. Surface detectability. So yeah, it's one of these ones where it's got shortish gun range, but the detectability is good. So 11.2 base. So you'll be able to get that to what, just under 9?
Yeah, or roughly around 9, I think.
Yeah. Or not under 9. It's certainly under 10. 9 point something is what I meant.
Will be fairly good at. Well, what's the range on the torps?
10 kilometers.
So you could technically stealth torp with a cruiser.
Yeah,
Yes.
there's a couple of those now. It used to be really only the Atago, and then there's a couple now where you can stealth torp at tier 8. Yeah, so it could potentially be quite an interesting one. But I think the main point of interest about it is going to be the fact that it is quite funky looking. It's a mini Nelson. In terms of how it actually plays, we do have other stealthy, kind of low-ranged heavy cruisers at the tier. But I mean, for the British especially, I mean, what does it stand in contrast to? There's obviously the Albemarle, there's the Cheshire, which has got the 9-inch guns, and again, fairly short-ranged. Big old Citadel. It'll be interesting to see what the Citadel looks like on this one. That might actually be a bigger selling point than anything else. It's less squashy than the likes of the Cheshire.
Yeah, well, I mean, if it's got a bit more armor and it's all forward, in theory, it should also be physically smaller. So,
yeah. So what else is there? There's there's Tiger 59, and the less said about that, the better. There's Belfast 43, and there's Hampshire. That's its kind of and Cheshire. That's its direct competition at tier 8 in terms of premium Royal Navy cruisers. So yeah, we'll see how it fits in along those. But yeah, same smoke as Belfast 43, but obviously a longer reload than Belfast 43. But if it's got better armor than Belfast, and if it's sort of punching more towards the end of Cheshire, I mean, it's certainly got a lot more barrels than Cheshire. Cheshire's only got 6 guns going for it. And Hampshire's not bad, but it's a slightly unwieldy layout. So yeah, could be interesting potentially, but it does also sort of looking at it. There's actually more tier 8 premium Royal Navy cruisers than one might think. Not to mention all the other nations, of course. So the last one on this list is one that we now know is going to be a steel ship, the Gato, tier 10 US sub. I do wonder if this is just going to be wargaming, seeing how much interest they can get with steel subs.
Yeah, I mean, I do find it quite funny that it's the Gato at tier 10 as a steel ship, considering that steel ships are supposed to be kind of a little bit special.
Yes.
Where you've got the Balau as the standard tier 10 sub, and the Balau is actually the successor to the Gato.
I honestly think they are angling to the fact that they've held back the Gato, which if it was a fairly important sub design for the Americans for World War II, especially for the Pacific. The fact that they've held it back to be something, either a premium or whatever, or as it's turned out, a steel ship, makes me think that they've done that on purpose, and that they're hoping to entice more people to maybe get it that way. And it is representing Gato itself, so we've got quite distinctive camouflage on it. It's not just representing the entire class. It's going to have, where are we? High speed on the surface, but low speed underwater. And they are aiming to make it more geared towards the use of the non-homing torpedoes. The homing torps, where are we? I'll also have a look at the actual torp numbers they're giving.
Yeah, the non-homing are more like the gearing torps.
Yeah,
like
so 16.5
range.
kilometers, 66 knots. So this almost is like, given that it is essentially gearing torps on a submarine, it's kind of like this is almost becoming a stand-in destroyer. Now, homing torps are only 6 kilometers and do considerably less damage. but they're also going to be harder to dodge. So even though they do less damage, if you're in a destroyer and they do manage to get you at close range, it might still be enough to give you a very bad day indeed.
So they're basically running the Gato as kind of the US fleet submarines playing the role they were originally supposed to, but never quite got to do.
I guess so. Yeah. Yeah. Surface speed, a completely wildly ahistorical 34 knots. Submerged speed 17 knots, which is probably also wildly ahistorical, but I guess we're used to that by now.
Yeah, it should be 21 and.
Yeah. And it's the usual consumables as well.
Yeah, it's basically it does have a secondary gun.
That's true. Yeah, it's got a single 76mm gun. So secondary spec all the way. So yeah, I think probably the main thing about that is the main interesting point is the fact that they've put that as a steel ship, considering it's a pretty famous class of World War II subs. So yeah. We do also have, I mean, I think the next line we're getting is going to be
Soviet subs.
Wasn't it the Royal Navy subs? Haven't they been announced?
Oh, they
Actually,
started
no, we don't
already.
really know, do we? Because there's the Pan American cruisers coming along as well.
We are already early access for British subs.
Oh yes. Wow, that's a brain fart. Yeah, of course, the early access event has already started for the. So it will be the Royal Navy subs.
We are currently in super early access for Pan-American cruises. We are in actual early access for British submarines, and we are still in early access for US
the American hybrids. Yeah, it gets a bit confusing sometimes because they kind of stack things on top of each other rather than giving them a bit of breathing room. But yeah, so there we are. Even more subs to look forward to, and now there's going to be a steel sub as well. Yay.
Yeah, I think that concludes the ships. Now, there are minor changes. There are a few other things that might be worth mentioning.
Yeah, there's been sort of various blogs.
If I can duck out at this point, if that's okay.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Sorry,
being on your phone makes it a bit hard to look at these. I guess. So thanks for joining us though, Drac. That was interesting as always.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, hopefully next time I'll actually be at my computer, not in a car. Yeah. Right. Cheers. See you.
Okay. Bye.
See you, Drac. So for anyone not aware, Drac's got a very excellent YouTube channel where he covers all kinds of naval history topics, and he's got a website at drakinafel.co.uk as well, where you can see articles and pictures and things. So there you go.
Yes.
So yeah, we don't have too much longer to go, but yeah, it's I think the ones we wanted to talk about: the air defense mechanic,
air defense, and the economy,
and the economy change. I don't know if we want to talk about ship balance things.
I think we can skip the other ones for now.
Yeah. Okay.
So
which should we go for first? I
mean, the economy is the older one, but
yeah, okay, we'll go with that then. That's as good a basis as any.
So basically, Wargame, the community has asked for 7 years that spotting should be rewarded in the game. So Wargaming was like, okay, we hear you. We'll now reward spotting, but you can't have only good things. So we're gonna nerf a bunch of other stuff. That's nobody asked. So here we are.
Now, for reference, how World of Tanks does it and how they've done it forever is that a light tank or whoever it is that's doing the active spotting of an enemy that's taking damage gets a portion of the XP and credits from the tank that's doing the damage, basically. So it's supposed to be like the same overall, but a share of it goes to the tank that is enabling that damage to happen. That's not what they're proposing here. What they're proposing here is just nerfing everything else a bit to compensate for the fact that there is now going to be XP for spotting. So I'm not sure how I feel about that, to be honest. I think doing it the World of Tanks way would have been fine.
Yeah, it's weird because they say basically doing damage and spotting gives the same amount of experience, which means that there is more experience in the battle if somebody else does the spotting, right? So basically, like the World of Tanks where there's always the same amount of experience to be had because it's just split. And here is like, if you do your own spotting, then your team overall just gets less experience in a sense.
Yes. So it does seem a bit of a weird way of doing it. And it does, to be honest, seem like they're doing it differently just for the sake of being different when there is a very well-established mechanic from World of Tanks that just absolutely works fine.
Yeah.
It is a bit odd. I think there's a spotting mechanic thing going on in certainly for ground vehicles in War Thunder as well, but I honestly have no idea how it works in terms of then splitting up rewards on the end screen. I don't know if there is for naval or for air combat. But yeah, this does seem to like, considering that there are classes like CVs that can pick up lots of spotting without really, like, they're not trying to get extra spotting, they're just picking it up sort of accidentally, as it were. You know, it might unduly reward some classes, and so it's sort of punishing everyone else at the same time, because if you've got somebody, I mean, like in a good spotting game in a destroyer might pick up, say, 100,000 spotting damage. It's kind of like, even if I'm not actively out there trying to spot, you know, it's not like World of Tanks where you go and park yourself in a bush in a light tank and, you know, you're giving up the chance to do damage yourself to do spotting for your team. It's not really like that in World of Warships. So if you're picking up a bunch of spotting, even sort of even if you're trying to be active on the front lines in a destroyer, you know, your primary goal is probably still more to maybe try and drop torpedoes on somebody using your stealth or counter enemy destroyers rather than spotting the enemy team.
I mean, it really depends, because spotting is rather valuable, especially if you have
yes, it can be very
cruisers
useful,
from
but the
smoke
point I'm
and
getting at
behind
is
islands.
that in doing that inadvertently, you're sort of hurting everybody else's scores overall, because you're sort of getting the XP from
Yeah, you mean if it
that,
were split?
Well, no, I mean, if it was split, you'd be sort of picking up some of the XP
The reward
or whatever
from somebody
from
else.
the people
Now it's
doing the
just
damage.
benefiting everyone if you do.
But this is then it's sort of arguably hurting those specific players in terms of their bottom line. But this way, it's hurting everybody in terms of their bottom line, because they're just nerfing everything else to compensate. So, I mean, neither system is arguably ideal, but I know which one I prefer.
I mean, the thing is, we don't know by how much, right? What they're saying is they want to keep the average earnings similar, which sort of makes sense, but they basically reduce the rewards for dealing direct damage, and instead spotting gives you the same reward as direct damage. That part makes sense, but then they've also reduced the reward. Like, for spotted ribbons, that makes sense because now spotting it's directly rewarded. But why would they need to reduce the reward for defended ribbons or for potential damage? Like, those two things just make no sense, right? They're like, okay, we finally reward a support ability, so we need to nerf other support stuff.
Like, the one part of this that I do like is where they are at least increasing. They say that they're thinking about doing it, so they increase the reward for damage done by secondary armament, which I didn't even know was that damage was weighted less than primary armament damage, but apparently. I mean, it would be nice to see this with some actual numbers. It's just on the face of it, I don't like the idea of it as they're presenting it.
No, they took a good concept, rewarding spotting, and mutilated it into this.
Yeah, basically.
Like generally, they should think about how to reward a lot of sport activities more. But instead they were like, oh, the community always wanted spotting. Let's give it to them. How can we do that? Well, by pissing off the entire community in the process.
The weird thing to me is that by taking away the flag rewards from different the in-game achievements, that would have been a perfect way to give more rewards to spotting, like introduce some kind of spotting medal and say, if you do this much spotting for your team, you get some flags or a booster or something like that. Like that, there was a way to directly reward good sort of support gameplay, spotting gameplay, whatever. Didn't involve sort of taking XP away from other areas that you might also sort of want to promote to encourage good gameplay. So it's weird. They could have absolutely gone down that route. They could have kept rewards on the in-game awards and introduced one for spotting if they wanted to reward spotting, and instead we're going down this sort of slightly dubious route.
They have an achievement for spotting. They only introduced it after they removed the rewards.
I had forgotten that. If that's
there is a spotted medal. It's like the participation medal for carriers.
Okay. Yeah, it's one of those things where it just doesn't. They don't really stick in the mind anymore because you don't get anything for them. So it's like it's just a meaningless thing on the. The only one I have to pay attention to is if I get a Kraken, basically.
The biggest problem with the whole concept is that, the things that do the most spotting are carriers, and by a large margin. Like back when they were still talking about submarines and throwing a lot of statistics around, there was a statistic about spotting, and basically they tried to make a point about submarines. But the statistic had all classes in there, and they revealed that carriers on average just do so much more spotting than anything else combined, right? It was like a complete different world for carrier spotting on average. So we know that like almost all spotting comes from carriers compared to every other class. So like rewarding spotting, while generally a good thing because, destroyers that spot should be rewarded in a sense, and it should be encouraged for destroyers to provide some spotting, is like that the class that doesn't need it will get the most out of it, probably. So we'll see how they balance it. Carriers already get less rewards for dealing damage because they do too much damage.
They would almost have to weight it against carriers specifically, because otherwise it would make things unbalanced. I don't know. Maybe Wargaming will knock it out the park and they'll come out with a system that's kind of fair for everybody, includes spotting damage and rewards it appropriately. But I think we've been playing the game at this point long enough, both of us, to be a little bit cynical. I think about their ability to come up with something that doesn't have some kind of flaw.
At this point, it's just realistic, not cynical.
Yeah.
So Wargaming has once again taken a concept that I agree of and mutilated it, and something that they've managed to do something that the community has asked for a long time and made it into something that they don't want, in a sense. So it's a skill, I guess.
Yes, but that isn't necessarily as bad as the next idea that they floated, which is the change to air defense mechanics that they're doing in closed testing, which basically involves a new role for depth strike planes.
Yes, Wargaming has the genius idea that the planes that usually are used against submarines and on depth strikes, drop depth charges, can be repurposed and have an alternate firing mode where you can launch a plane that attacks planes. So the way is you basically, the way I understand it is you place a ground target like you would, but instead of the planes flying there and dropping depth charges, they patrol this area then and attack incoming aircraft. But they don't really do damage to that aircraft, they prevent that aircraft from spotting, and they increase the AA effectiveness on those planes, which like they want to combine that with the earlier AA idea, where your anti-air has a chance to actually shoot at the planes that attack you instead of planes that don't attack you. So you can now repurpose your depth charges, assuming you have planes, to make them fighters that could attack aircraft, and that aircraft can't spot, and then your AA has a higher chance of actually shooting at the planes that attack you. Let's let this sink in for a minute. And Wargaming, that's the same company that said they can't do minimap spotting only for carriers, because that would be too complicated.
It's so, the whole thing is just so convoluted. I don't know. I feel like somebody had a shower thought about what can we do? What extra thing can we? We've got depth charge planes in the game now on some ships. What extra thing can we foist upon them to? We've already added extra strain to damage control parties by adding submarines. How can we add extra strain to the use of your depth charge planes potentially? And yeah, I mean, I guess it's not quite as bad as the example of damage control parties, but it feels so very much like it's looking in the wrong direction. As it's like, if they want to do something about AA, then I am all for it, because AA just feels partly it feels ineffective, but I think the biggest offense against it is that it has so little interaction with the player. The most you can do is basically sector your AA. It's not even like previously where you could prioritize a certain squad and feel like you had at least a bit more interaction with what was going on. These days it's literally just sector your AA and get a little bit of a boost to the numbers that you see flashing up on the planes as they fly by and drop bombs on you or whatever. So instead of trying to address that, instead of doing something that will make the AA feel more effective to the player, basically they've come up with this like tag your depth charge planes onto an attack squad to keep them in your AA for longer, essentially, and stop them from spotting you. And the class that would be most useful on destroyers and maybe some sneaky cruisers are quite often the class that do not have a depth charge airstrike to call in. They just use rail depth charges. So again, it's sort of completely missing the point. And it just feels like it's an idea that's going so wildly off in the wrong direction as to be not completely useless, but the class it's going to be most useful for are, battleships, I guess. And a lot of those tend to have the best AA at their tiers anyway. So, yeah, although some don't, to be fair. You've got Italian battleships, for example, which have got terrible AA. But, yeah, it's weird. It's a weird idea. And at least there was some merit to the idea of jiggling around, maybe rebalancing how XP and credits are given based on spotting, which has been long neglected. But this is just no Wargaming. You can do a lot better than this. You can come up with something that's a lot fairer and a lot more effective than this. This is just weird and it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's like, especially there is the fighter consumable in the game, which is one of the most useless consumables because the fighters generally don't engage the
a lot of the time it's a gamble. Like even like we were talking about the hybrid battleships earlier, and one of the unique things about those is the US hybrid battleship side branch, is that they can launch a fighter. And I've quite often had the experience of you launch the fighter and they just don't do anything. Just fly around in a little circle, that's it, and they fly back. And they haven't done anything.
But instead of doing anything with those, they try to convert the depth charges into the, and that also means that you have to decide like if you want to use them against the sub or against the carrier. Or I'm not sure how often you attack by both simultaneously.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's just it's one from the wargaming department of what were they drinking?
Yeah,
it's bizarre.
Oh well, I mean this is close testing, right? It's one of those things that will possibly never see the light of day. But it's so sad because they like, instead of going for a simple fix that would work, when it comes to like carriers and spotting and anti-air, they try more and more weird and complex things that make no sense whatsoever, right? It's I mean, it wouldn't really be that hard to do something against carrier spotting. It just, I don't know.
Even if it was something indirect, like changing up like AA captain skills would be a way of doing it. You wouldn't necessarily even have to dig into the current AA mechanics. You could make AA builds a viable thing once again.
Exactly. Like that you are forced to actually invest into it, but when you do, the payoffs are clearly there, which is currently not the case.
Especially for, I mean, certain destroyer lines. Like the only one at the moment that there's kind of individual destroyers on other lines and maybe some individual premiums, but like the only one that has semi-effective AA or decently effective AA, depending on who if you're seeing a carrier 2 tiers below you, is the Swedish destroyer line.
Yep.
Even the US line, which once upon a time back in the old RTS days, if you took the right skills and had the defensive, they were some of the best anti-aircraft destroyers in the game, and they just got gutted. Defensive
fire, imagine if they made that consumable more useful again. Like the defensive fire should
that's another thing. They could change how defensive works.
Yeah, they should rework defensive, they should rework the fighter planes, and they should rework the anti-air skills, and then they should make like carrier spotting min-map only, and and we would be in a good spot. But instead we get this.
I mean, Tom, to answer your question about why we never brought these ideas up, ideas were brought up to wargaming all the time. Trust me. And the only time that it felt like CC's had any direct input was when they did things like the CC conferences and whatever, and even then they would take those ideas and twist them into something fairly unrecognizable. So wargaming doesn't have a good history of listening to even their own sort of curated player groups. And to be fair to them, I guess it seems like that's not a thing that a lot of online games do. And even when, like, the famous example I can think of is EVE Online has got like an actual whole player council, and even then there's been controversies in the past where they've sort of done suggested things that the community wasn't on board with, or that the parent company has sort of disregarded ideas, or it doesn't stop there being controversies. But I mean there are, I'm sure, I can't even remember anything specifically, but there are plenty of examples I can think of just from my times as CC where there were "I told you so" moments, and there probably have been since myself and A-Time left, and will continue to be "I told you so" moments where wargaming just comes up with these sometimes at odds with reality ideas, and they don't go very well, and everyone goes, "But I told you so." And there's a couple of examples the other way, and probably the famous one is when radio location was introduced, and everyone went, "Oh my god, that's a terrible idea! It's going to break the game." And that's like a rare counterexample of wargaming being able to go, "I told you so." But mostly, it's been the other way around.
It's like the only defense wargaming has. It's like, look, once we were right. 99 times wrong, once right. We will be right again in the future. Trust us.
Yeah. So this whole concept, and it is just a concept that they're doing a closed test of, but this whole concept feels like if it did go ahead, it would surely never survive, or it would just meet with a negative reaction because it's just so far off anything that would actually be useful to players that, eventually it will become another "I told you so." So that's my thoughts on that. It's not a great idea.
No, it really isn't. But hey, suppose with that note we can end it.
Yes, I don't think there's anything else really to bring up. No, just having a quick glance at the portal. There is a video contest on the official Discord. There's some thing to do with 3D printing that I guess was some kind of contest that I didn't even pay attention to. Early access to Spanish Cruiser if you're a Prime member. Yeah, there's I don't think there's anything.
This is the very early access.
Yes,
super early access. Yeah, because that was needed.
Oh well, next time. So maybe we'll have some more positive something to end on rather than ranting about ideas that don't really stand up to too much scrutiny or sanity checks.
Who knows?
Yes.
Well, I guess on that note, we'll call it a night. And thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good night. We'll be back next time.
Bye.
Bye.